We do have a caller who is not a football guru on the phone, but I do know, I believe, who this is. So.
Oh, good. Is it Sonny Cruz?
It very well may be Sonny Cruz Part 2. Hello, thank you for calling.
Caller, are you there?
Am I on the line?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm a football fan. I actually played football a long time ago in the 1970s.
Okay.
Iowa State. What are you guys talking about? You talking about the NFL combines today?
We're talking about what would you like to talk about? You tell us. We're all over the map, so whatever you want to talk about.
Oh, okay. That's good. I find it interesting. I've been doing a little thinking and viewing and about the historically black football teams and the development or underdevelopment of historically black football teams compared to predominantly white football teams. Have you all ever gave a show on that or gave any thought to that?
I have given thought to that because I think you're right. I think the SWAC gets very little run. Teams like Grambling and Alcorn State, they don't get a whole lot of pub, and it's unfortunate. But unfortunately, there's no reason for those teams not to be able to succeed more. I know Doug Williams gave it a shot at Grambling, wasn't very successful, but I think it needs if there's a bigger spotlight shined on it, I think these teams can get better and the players can get more known for it.
You say Doug Williams wasn't successful? What do you mean by that?
Not as a head coach at Grambling, no.
Oh, okay, at Grambling. Oh, yeah. I'm looking at the non-development of these historically black colleges. Why are these historically black colleges today in such a deplorable situation when it comes to the economics and the non-ranking of their teams?
The biggest reason, and I hate to put it so bluntly, is because the bigger schools, the Michigans, the Alabamas, the USCs, have a lot of people that have a lot of money backing them, where these historically black colleges, unfortunately, are in more poverty-stricken areas, so they don't have a lot of alumni giving a lot of money.
I'm just wondering, how did these teams like Michigan and Ohio State get so much money?
Because they are bigger programs and have bigger alums and a bigger just a bigger fan base to draw from. It's just an unfortunate circumstance of the way things are. I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this. It's because unfortunately a lot of those historically black colleges are in much more poor and poverty-stricken areas, so it's much more difficult for them to get the money they need to build the kind of programs they have to be able to compete on a level with Alabama, with Michigan, with UCLA, with USC, with Arizona.
Well, when you look at the area, when you look at the geographical areas of schools like Michigan or Ohio State, and you look at the geographical area of a team like Alabama or Miami, as far as that concerned, particularly a team like Alabama, which is in a real rural area. If you're going to make a comparison by poverty-stricken area, University of Alabama, the number one team in the country, is in a very rural area. So why does a school like the University of Alabama have such success, even though they exist in a rural? Because in order
to get that success, it started off them as an actual white college.
Fish, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're experiencing a lot of echoing on the callers, and so I don't know if it's because you have speakers turned up or something, but we're experiencing.
I took my speakerphone off, and maybe that'll help out.
Yeah, that sounds much better.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, as I was saying, is that Alabama, when it started off, until Bear Bryant actually allowed or wanted the integration, it was actually a very white school, and unfortunately back then, as were the times, the white people are the ones who had the money, so they put the money into those schools, and they didn't care about the historically black colleges. Fortunately, we live in times where it's not like that anymore, but because the alumni from those other white colleges and colleges that were historically white have bigger bases to draw from, they end up having more successful people coming out of those schools, and those are the ones that give back. It's not where the school is actually located necessarily. It's the people who went to those schools and graduated from those schools who then in turn feel like they need to give back to that school.
Now look at the University of Miami. Back in the early 70s, they were a non-competitive football team. They were a very non-competitive football team, and they became a football powerhouse overnight. What do you think it was the main reason for the University of Miami to come out of nowhere and become
there was a great ESPN has done this great series called 30 for 30, and one of the ones they did was called The U, and it was based on, obviously, the rise of Miami and how Miami football became so amazing. It's because before they were afraid to go into the inner city of Miami to do their recruiting. Once they said, to hell with it, that's what we're going to start doing, and they started recruiting these amazing athletes from the inner cities of Miami, from places in Miami where other people didn't want to go to. That's where they started getting these incredible athletes, and that's when they started winning.
Yes, that's exactly the point I was wanting to make.
And I actually did see that special fish on the U, and it was fantastic.
Yeah, that was a great show. It showed the reason University of Miami and a lot of other major colleges became so prosperous and highly ranked is because they went out and recruited the black blue chip football players.
And that's probably why what people consider lesser schools, that shouldn't be, is because these other black chip, these blue chip players, young, talented athletes, are going to more predominant considered schools. And I think that makes the program struggle as well.
Absolutely, and not to be blunt about it, but we like to think that we live in times where racism isn't prevalent, but right. I think that unfortunately we still do, and for some reason those black colleges are held down. They're not held down because nobody's stopping them, but
right.
The blue chip athletes want to go to the bigger schools, unfortunately, because if you could get a group of blue chip athletes
to say to the NFL too. They go to the bigger schools. They feel like they're going to be scouted more by the NFL, where
or at least see
right.
more, because you're going to see Michigan on ESPN because ESPN
National
or Fox
television.
or CBS has a contract with that conference, whereas the SWAC, which is where the historically black schools are located, mostly the Southwestern Athletic Conference, unfortunately doesn't have one of those big television contracts. And that's the other thing that brings big money into the school, is the television contracts. Those historically black colleges also are not part of the BCS at all, so they're not getting the money from the BCS, because when a team makes the BCS, not only does that school get money, that entire conference gets a boatload of money from the game. The historically black colleges aren't in that realm, and that's completely unfair. There's no reason they shouldn't be, but they're not.
Take a look at this perspective here. Before 1964, you had Jim Crow laws and legal segregation. At that time, all white colleges played all white colleges, and all black colleges played all black colleges. They didn't compete against each other. And white colleges were protected against competition from historically black college football teams. They did not have to play the historically black football teams. Only the white colleges were allowed to play on national television, and only the white colleges were ranked in the top 20 as the top teams in the country, and only white college players won the Heisman Trophy award, and only white colleges played for the national championship. So there was a mythology that was allowed to be projected throughout the country that predominantly white colleges were the superior football programs in the country. Even now, that perspective was the only perspective that was disseminated amongst the American population, because white colleges were not allowed to play on national television and be seen as for what they were. Now, after 1964, legal segregation was terminated and Jim Crow laws were discontinued. And at that particular point in time, from my perspective, there was a threat made to the existence of the mythology that what predominantly white football programs were the superior football teams in the country, because now we have segregation not being legally protected. Now these historically black football teams would have an opportunity to play against the predominantly white colleges. And if that happened, from my perspective, I think we all know what would have happened, because all black blue chip football players were attending historically black colleges at the time. So
I think that this debate, is something that we could, not to cut you off, but I think this is something that, this debate is going to go on, unfortunately, a lot longer than we want it to. As far as America, I mean, we like to think that everything is all caught up, and when people start to question why, this school gets more money than that school, or why this school doesn't get much attention, it all boils down to one thing, and it's money. Who has the TV contracts? Who has the bigger boosters? And it's just something that is going to rule. I mean, whoever has the money is going to end up getting the better athletes. And unfortunately for the smaller schools, they suffer for it. And it's just a shame that that's the way it is. And unfortunately, money's going to continue to rule the situation. So, I thank you for your time, and I appreciate you listening. Absolutely.
Can I say one? Oh, just one more thing. I was going to say that the reason that these historically black football teams are not making hundreds of millions of dollars a year as the predominantly white schools is because the black blue chip football player left the historically black football teams in the 60s and went over to the predominantly white football teams. If they would have stayed at the historically black colleges, they would have been the top ranked 20 teams in the country.
Oh, you are absolutely right, because if you look at these schools that were predominantly white, now if you look at the football teams, they are not predominantly white anymore. Obviously, they're mixed, and they're predominantly African American athletes, and those are the teams that are the best teams in the country, obviously. So you have an excellent point there that had that money and had those athletes stayed at those predominantly black colleges, those colleges, Grambling, would be the top colleges in the country. There's no question.
Why do you think they left these historically black teams?
Because I think my partner said it perfectly, and it's because of the TV contracts, because there's a lot more exposure, and now there's so much money in the NFL. These players want exposure. They've been told that they'll be seen by more people if they go to Alabama, if they go to Michigan, if they go to Ohio State, and that's why they go to these colleges, because they can get seen more, end up making more money, and they can ply their trade, and people can see how good they are and how fantastic they are. And unfortunately, those little colleges,
it's about exposure. The little colleges don't give them the exposure that they want to launch their career to the next level.
But the NFL went to the historically black colleges and got all of the black players that play in the NFL. So the NFL does go to these. They know where the talent is at, and they go to these small colleges, even today, even back then. All of the black football players that play in the NFL, you know where they got them from? They went to the historically black colleges back in those days. They didn't go. So going to a predominantly white college, even back then, was not the key to being exposed and getting an NFL contract, because the NFL, in fact, went to the predominantly black colleges because they knew where the talent was at.
Well, I understand all those points, and I really do thank you for your time, and I thank you for listening to the show, and hopefully you'll continue to listen. We do have another guest that we're going to be coming on in a few minutes. So, you have a nice night, and thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great night.
So, you know what, Fish? I have to say, and I don't mean this to sound sarcastic, but February is Black History Month, and I think I just got my history lesson as far as smaller schools.
Absolutely, but to be honest with you, and I know people are absolutely going to rake me over the coals for this, I think part of the problem is having a Black History Month, and I say that not because people shouldn't know what happened and how it was, but, that's what segregation is. We are separating them when we say there's a Black History Month. It's not. People are people. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. And Martin Luther King said it best. It's the content of your character. So as soon as you separate them and say, okay, we have to have a Black History Month, then all of a sudden you're separating that group of people, and that group of people should not be separated.
Exactly. And it is, unfortunately, what it boils down to is it's about the TV money. It's about the, it's about the boosters. It's about all of that. It's about who's giving them the exposure.
And in the 60s, there were, it's not like there isn't today, because there are plenty, but in the 60s it was more, more acceptable to be allowed to be closed-minded and be bigoted. And you know what? That's not acceptable anymore. And that's the only area where we've actually moved forward, is that it's not acceptable to be that way anymore, and nor should it be. It's disgusting, and people are and that's why this whole Michael Sam, and you want to bring it to today. That's why the whole Michael Sam situation is so huge, because there are people who are bigoted towards him because of his sexual orientation, and it's on a smaller scale, but it's the same sort of thing.
I was listening to before when you had your caller in, where you said it's the content of your character. Martin Luther King said that. Mm-hmm. I love that you said that when you were, and not to segue, but Martin Luther King got his doctorate at Boston University, and I have his quotes all over, and I think that's so true, that it's not the money or anything like that. So if that's the American spirit, I hope
absolutely, and unfortunately, the world would be a much better place if more people only cared about the content of people's characters and not how much money they have in their bank account, the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, the accent they speak with, anything like that. None of that should matter.
Exactly. I agree, and I agree. I heard the comment too on the. I was paying attention. I'm writing down all these notes. You were talking about the Black History Month, and I don't disagree on that either. I think that I do work in the school system in my real job, and I see it. I mean, I see the continued segregation where it's like, why are we doing this? I mean, I understand, but why don't we now celebrate? We just integrate and celebrate all people that were significant in our history instead of perpetuating the separateness. So I loved your show so far.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that, and I'm sure that everyone's going to love it even further as we delve into this very serious topic, because as Pamela said, we do love to have fun on the show, but once in a while we do like to get into things that are very serious as well, because we are, believe it or not, we're very intelligent people and can think deeply as well. So. And we really wanted to get into a very tough topic to get into, which is about the historically black colleges. And I applaud him for calling it and talking about that, because that's a topic that people really ignore. So thank you very much, and just have a great week, everyone, and be safe.
Be safe, everybody. Have a fantastic week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
How you design those programs. In all of the programs that I attended, all of the education that I had, college, public, and otherwise, nobody ever told me that I was an African woman. Nobody ever told me what the history of African people were. Nobody ever told me that America is business, and without business you will have nothing and be nothing. And nobody ever told me how to organize business so that I would be able to develop institutions in my own community. So now the sincerity of all of the programs and all of the education has to be questioned, indicted, and convicted, because the bottom line is that America is not and has never tried to produce African adults who are functional, self-sufficient, who understand their politics, their economics, and their relationship to the world politics and the world economics.
America is unified with the NAACP, the Urban League, and the traditional we shall overcome civil rights leaders of the 50s and 60s that have been all but abandoned and ignored by younger people, Sister Soldier included.
I think that the dice are loaded, and that's what's left out of Mr. Brown's piece. See, there was a period of time in this country after Reconstruction where African people owned a lot of land, owned a lot of businesses, and did a lot of things. But what happened was the American government, the Ku Klux Klan, and other organizations organized in smashing that effort. So it's not that we haven't tried to own lands and have not organized businesses. It's that if you are African in America, or in Latin America, or in the Caribbean, or in the continent, you will be hunted no matter what you do, because they do not want us to survive and become self-sufficient. And you can say no, but you haven't lived this life. You haven't lived this life.
And to be happy. We want to have food. I'm talking about that. All right. Now, to paraphrase Senator Bradley of New Jersey, the state from which your piece was.
Senator Bradley gets much right when he talks.
He does, and he, among other things, and he's not claiming to be particularly original with the observation, We can't get there unless we go together. I have a terrible feeling that behind me are some people who do not agree.
Senator Bradley of the all-white United States Senate said we can't get there unless we all go there together. Sorry, none of us are where he is. That's number one. Number two, you're making a moral appeal to a country that doesn't have a moral conscience. The question becomes that when white people feel serious and angry and upset about abortion, they come out in the thousands up to the millions to say, this is what we believe about abortion. Where is the white outcry against white racism that murders African people all around this entire globe? It doesn't exist. So who are these white good people? I want to meet them. I want to see them. I feel it's not enough.
But that might be all we can get.
And guess what? I don't work with all I can get. What I work with is what I have. Listen, you have to have some confidence in the power of African people amongst ourselves to establish a foundation.
We have.
No, we haven't. We have utter chaos in our cities, and you got to see that. You can have a program. I'm not saying we've built a lot of institutions, and those institutions have not been effective. The majority of millions of African youth in this country are dying mentally, dying spiritually, dying emotionally, dying academically. And you may have a program, Mr. Brown may have a program, but what we got to talk about is an American government that tracks millions of African people who don't go to your program, don't go to Brown's program, millions of African people, not only here, but all around the world. And if we are not honest enough to say who are our friends, who are our enemies, to know what a friend is, to know what an enemy is, we will constantly be trying to get into people's parties, to shake our butts with them, to get them to like us, and that's not the question. The question is, what can we build amongst ourselves to secure ourselves from our enemies so that we will be able to survive into the future?
Mayor Kelly.
It's enough to know that if I walk out Washington, D.C. tonight, some black kid in Washington, D.C. is blowing up another black kid's head for a pair of sneakers because the institutions that we're talking about, not the things that we hold up to say, look, this is one example. The institutions that we're talking about are not saving the minds of those African children. That is the honest truth. None of these Negroes saved me. None of these Negroes saved me. None of them. Listen, you know who saved me? A man named John DeSane in Englewood, New Jersey, who told me who I was, who showed me my history, who told me who my enemies were, who let me know that this was not an easy world, who let me know that this was a cold environment, who let me know that what he's not a part of is dilly-dallying with the minds of African children and letting them know what